The fine rain streamed down the city's rooftops like ancient tears. No one remembered crying anymore. It was a winter morning, one of those that seem suspended between sleep and waking, when the world hasn't quite decided if it's worth starting anew. The sky was a heavy grey, the kind that promises hours of endless drizzle, and the streets shimmered with the sad reflection of puddles forming on the uneven sidewalks. Cars moved slowly, headlights on even under the pale daylight, and people hurried along hidden beneath umbrellas of all colours, each lost in their own thoughts, in their own urgencies that seemed so critical in that moment. Before we dive into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us what city you're tuning in from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The woman walked with firm steps along the wet sidewalk, her high heels tapping a precise rhythm against the soaked asphalt. Each step echoed like a declaration of purpose, of someone who knew exactly where she was going and had no time to waste on distractions. Her grey trench coat shielded her from the cold, a designer, imported coat that cost more than many families spent on entire months of rent. But there was something in her gaze that suggested a different kind of coldness, one no fabric in the world could warm. Eleanor Vance was 52. A considerable fortune built on tough decisions, lonely late nights, and sacrifices she preferred not to recall on the rare evenings she managed to sleep soundly. She carried an emptiness she had learned to ignore with the same impeccable competence with which she managed her businesses, an emptiness that resided somewhere undefined between her chest and throat, and that sometimes tightened without warning, leaving her breathless for a few seconds that felt like forever. Her face bore the marks of time with discreet elegance, fine wrinkles around her eyes that told stories of sleepless nights studying reports, a subtle crease between her eyebrows that betrayed decades of accumulated worries, but it also carried something deeper, a hardness that came from within, from years of closing doors so as not to have to look at what lay on the other side, from decades of saying no to feelings that threatened to disrupt her carefully laid plans. She had learned very early, on that, the business world had no room for sentimentality, that the weak were devoured by the strong, and she had decided never to be among the weak. On that particular morning, she was heading to yet another meeting that would change absolutely nothing in her life. More numbers to analyze with critical eyes, more contracts to sign with her precise penmanship, more handshakes that meant everything for the spreadsheets and absolutely nothing for the soul. It would be a meeting like hundreds before it, with men in navy suits saying predictable things in air-conditioned rooms, smelling of expensive coffee, and poorly disguised ambition, and she would agree or disagree with the same calculated indifference as always. Her thoughts wandered through empty corridors of memories she preferred to keep under lock and key, when her body stopped before she could even realize what was happening. It was an involuntary movement, completely outside her usual control, as if her feet had received an order her mind hadn't consciously given, as if something much larger than herself was taking command in that instant. Eleanor wasn't used to losing control of anything, much less her own body, and the sensation left her momentarily, disoriented. The bus stop was there, with its broken shelter letting the fine rain through several cracks. It was a neglected structure like so many others in the city, rusted metal and cracked plastic from years of sun and weather without maintenance. A silent and uncomfortable reminder that not everyone has the privilege of waiting under intact roofs, that the city treated some of its inhabitants as if they were completely invisible, unworthy even of a functioning cover. But it wasn't the damaged structure that made her stop at that specific moment. It was the two figures huddled under that precarious shelter, seeking protection against elements that spared no one. A man and a child, wrapped together against the cold and damp, two silhouettes that seemed smaller than they should be, as if the world were compressing them. Father and daughter, This was immediately evident by the way he held her, as if he wanted to protect her not only from the physical cold that penetrated their bones, but from all the cruelty and injustice the world held, as if with his tired arms he could create an impenetrable shield against all the difficulties life insisted on putting in their way. It was an embrace from someone who had nothing left to offer but himself, and who offered that self with a generosity that would break the heart of anyone who truly saw it. Eleanor felt something change in the air around her, a subtle but absolutely unmistakable alteration, a different weight, a density that had no logical or rational explanation. It was as if time had decided to pause just for her, forcing her to look at what she normally ignored with the convenient haste of someone with engagements too important to dwell on human details. The city continued, its frantic movement around them, cars passing with the muffled sound of tires on water, people rushing with umbrellas, horns blaring in the distance, the usual routine that didn't stop for anyone and waited for no one. But there, in that small space of wet sidewalk in front of the broken bus stop, something different was happening, something she couldn't name precisely, but that she could feel with every fibre of her tense body. The man appeared to be just over 40, perhaps less. It was genuinely difficult to say for sure, because life on the streets ages people in cruel and accelerated ways that those with a roof over their heads can never fully comprehend. His dark hair was wet from the persistent drizzle, matted to his forehead in a sad tangle he no longer bothered to arrange, and several days of stubble revealed difficult weeks, sleepless nights in inadequate places, skipped meals, dignity constantly tested. His eyes had an indefinite color, perhaps brown, perhaps green, depending on the light hitting them, but above all, they had the unmistakable color of profound exhaustion, a weariness that went far beyond the physical and penetrated to the soul. But there was something in his posture that simply didn't match the miserable situation he was in, a silent, stubborn dignity that refused to disappear even in the worst circumstances, even when everything around screamed that he should surrender. A care in his gestures that spoke of a life that had once been completely different, of times when he occupied other spaces and received much more respectful glances. He brushed a wet strand of hair from the girl's face with a delicacy that made Eleanor involuntarily hold her breath. It was a small gesture, insignificant to anyone looking quickly from outside, but it carried so much concentrated love that it seemed impossible to fit into such a simple, everyday, profoundly human movement. The child was perhaps 7 or 8, no more than that for sure. Her face still held the round softness of childhood, cheeks that should be rosy and healthy but were too pale from cold and accumulated fatigue from many restless nights. But her eyes already knew shadows that children of that age should never know, had already seen things no cartoon prepares anyone to see or process. She clutched to her thin chest some carefully and almost religiously folded papers, children's drawings made with borrowed or found crayons that she protected as if they were absolutely priceless treasures, as if in those papers, crumpled from constant use, was kept everything that remained of a childhood that was slipping through her fingers like water through her hands. When she noticed the elegant woman standing there staring at them, Lily managed a shy smile, one of those that carry hope and fear mixed in perfectly equal and indistinguishable doses. It was a smile that asked for something without knowing exactly what, that offered friendship without expecting any reciprocity, that apologized for existing, while stubbornly insisting on shining despite all adverse circumstances. It was the kind of smile only children can give, that smile that still believes the world can be good, that good people exist, that tomorrow can be better than today. Eleanor didn't know exactly why she approached them. It was absolutely not her custom to stop for strangers on the street, much less strangers in obvious homelessness. It wasn't part of who she had become over the decades. This respected and often feared executive who didn't waste precious time on sentimentalities she considered useless. She was a woman of precisely calculated distances, of carefully measured and controlled involvements, of rigidly contained and managed emotions, as if they were just another asset in her investment portfolio. But her feet carried her to them as if obeying an order she hadn't consciously given at any moment, as if something much greater than her will, much greater than her reason, always so proud of itself, was taking command in that decisive instant. The man lifted his eyes just enough to reveal the abyssal depth of his exhaustion. It wasn't just physical, though the physical was also clearly there, marked in every line of his face prematurely aged by trials, in every slow movement of his limbs aching from the restless night on the hard ground. It was the devastating exhaustion of someone who fights every day to stay on his feet when absolutely everything in the universe conspires to bring him down. The exhaustion of someone who has lost so much along the way that he has even lost the energy to count the losses, to enumerate the accumulated defeats. There was shame there, too, etched in every feature of his face, that invisible and cruel wound that poverty imposes on those who once knew better days, who once were someone respectable, who once had a name and address and dignity in the eyes of the world that now completely ignored them. The millionaire noticed the details almost unintentionally, her gaze, trained by decades of analysis, automatically capturing information like a camera that can't stop photographing. The way he hid his trembling hand in the frayed sleeve of a coat, too thin for the biting cold. An instinctive gesture that betrayed cold and hunger in equal measure. The child's backpack leaning against the wall next to them, a popular cartoon character backpack that had seen much better days. Too heavy for a child of that size, probably carrying everything that remained of an entire life in a few pounds of worn and stained fabric from constant use. The disciplined and respectful silence of the two, as if they had learned the hard way that expecting too much from the world only brings more pain, that dreaming big when one sleeps so low is a sure recipe for more bitter disappointment. These were details that told a story by themselves, pieces of a complex puzzle that Eleanor didn't yet know she was beginning to assemble in her analytical mind. A crowded bus passed without stopping, the driver not even looking at the stop where they waited. Then another, equally indifferent to their existence. The drivers didn't even glance at those two figures waiting patiently in the rain, as if they were completely invisible, as if they didn't exist on the same plane of reality as the rest of the city, as if invisibility were the cruel price the poor pay for the unforgivable crime of not having money for taxis or their own cars or ride-sharing apps. The man looked away at the wet ground, and Eleanor recognized in that gesture of silent surrender the humiliation of someone who has been ignored too many times to count, the resignation of someone who has learned that certain battles simply aren't worth fighting because defeat is already written before it even begins. The girl began to play with one of the folded papers, making it an imaginary airplane that flew low between her small, dirty hands, making soft engine sounds with her mouth. It was a touching attempt to distract her own stomach, which rumbled with hunger, Eleanor noticed, with a painful tightness in her chest. That surprised her with its intensity, a way to forget the hunger that had surely been with her for many hours, perhaps entire days, to transform the endless and uncomfortable weight into something minimally bearable. Children have this magical and sad ability at the same time, to create imaginary worlds where reality fails to offer refuge, to find joy in crumbs when adults would need entire banquets to feel satisfied. There was something about that encounter that definitely didn't seem random, didn't seem casual or accidental like so many other crossroads that happen every day in big cities. Eleanor had spent her entire life firmly believing in numbers, in cold logic, in measurable and predictable cause and consequence. She had built her considerable fortune on spreadsheets and projections, on careful analyses and calculated decisions, on the unwavering certainty that absolutely everything in the universe could be predicted and controlled with the right variables. But there, before that defeated father and that hopeful daughter, she felt for the first time in a long time that some things simply happen because they need to happen, without any possible rational explanation, without any spreadsheet that could predict it. That the universe sometimes puts certain specific people in our path for reasons we will only understand much later, when we finally look back and connect the dots that at the moment seemed completely scattered and meaningless. The girl let slip, almost accidentally, in a tiny voice that bravely fought against the biting cold and against the discouragement of someone who had asked too much without ever receiving, "We just wanted to go home." The phrase cut through Eleanor like a sharp blade, severing defenses she didn't even know she had erected over so many years. To go home. 5 simple words that carried the weight of the entire world. How many times had she herself not wished for exactly that throughout her lonely life? To return to a home that no longer existed anywhere in the world, to a time that no money in the world could recover, to loved ones who were no longer there waiting for her with open arms. Her own mother, dead almost 3 decades ago from a sudden cancer that took her in a few months. A loss that still hurt on certain silent nights when sleep wouldn't come and memories insisted on returning. Her father, who left without ever having said he loved her, leaving an emptiness that no professional achievement had ever managed to completely fill. Home wasn't just a physical place with walls and a roof and an address. She understood in that moment with a painful clarity that left her momentarily breathless. It was a promise of security that the world sometimes tears away without asking permission or giving explanations. It was a deep feeling of belonging that not all the money in the world can buy back once lost. It was the place where we can truly be ourselves, without masks, without defenses, without the armor the world forces us to wear every day. The father hugged his daughter tighter against his chest, as if silently apologizing for not being able to give her what she needed and deserved, for having failed in some way he still couldn't fully accept. And in that silent and protective embrace, Eleanor saw so much condensed into a single simple gesture. She saw love. A fierce and unconditional love that didn't surrender to circumstances no matter how adverse, that continued to burn even when everything around was cold and dark. She saw despair, the silent and contained despair, of someone who doesn't know how he will get through another day, another night, another week of uncertainties and deprivations. She saw the silent and stubborn courage of someone who keeps fighting even when all doors close in their face, even when every attempt ends in resounding failure, even when hope seems an impossible luxury for people like them. "May I offer you some hot coffee?" The words left Eleanor's mouth before she could think them or measure them, before she could evaluate the consequences or calculate the risks, before the usual Eleanor, the calculating and distant Eleanor protected by layers of indifference, could stop them from escaping. The man looked at her with genuine surprise, his eyes widening for a moment, then with cautious distrust, then with something that looked like deep shame. He hesitated for a long moment that seemed to last an eternity, his wounded dignity waging a fierce battle against the basic need to feed his daughter, his pride fighting a losing battle against the cold that penetrated his bones and the hunger that had gnawed at his stomach for days. "You don't have to," he began, his voice choked with contained emotion. "I know I don't have to," Eleanor interrupted him, with a firmness in her voice that surprised herself as much as it did him. "I'm offering because I want to, because I need to, in some way I can't quite understand yet." The girl looked at her father with immense eyes full of hope, eyes that still firmly believed that good things could happen without warning, that good people were scattered throughout the world, that not everything was this cold and indifferent place that the last few weeks had shown with such cruelty. That childlike pleading gaze decided the matter once, and for all. The father simply couldn't resist that look, couldn't deny his daughter a small joy when joys had become so terribly rare in their lives in recent months. He nodded his head, an almost imperceptible movement of surrender, and slowly rose from the cold ground where he had been sitting, his muscles protesting the abrupt movement, helping his daughter to her feet with all the care in the world. The local bake shop was just a few blocks away, one of those neighborhood bakeries found on every corner of American cities for ages, with its display cases full of warm, freshly baked goods and colorful pastries of all kinds, with its comforting smell of fresh coffee brewing and dough baking that escaped through the half-open door. Eleanor guided them silently along the short path, feeling the weight of that moment with every step on the wet sidewalk, aware that something was changing within her, though she didn't yet know exactly what or where that change would lead her. The glass door opened with a soft, welcoming chime, and the contrast with the world outside was almost cruelly intense. The warmth of the environment enveloped them immediately like a long-awaited embrace, warming bones that had forgotten what warmth was. The smell of fresh bread promised satiety and comfort, memories of better times. The yellowish lights created an atmosphere of coziness and security that seemed from a completely different world. Everything they hadn't had for so long, everything they had lost along the painful path was there, within reach of a simple door, separated from them only by the invisible and cruel line that divides those who have from those who have absolutely nothing. The girl explored the place with wide eyes of genuine wonder, as if every detail was a rare and precious spectacle deserving of all her attention. The display cases with colorful pastries in perfect rows, shiny glazed donuts, colorful cupcakes, and golden pastries lined up like small edible jewels that gleamed temptingly under the light. The polished wooden tables where families ate breakfast peacefully, as if it were the most normal and natural thing in the world, unaware of the privilege of having that moment of peace. The impeccably white marble counter where a server in an apron observed them with a mix of poorly disguised curiosity and silent judgment, her eyes automatically assessing their worn and stained clothes, the evident appearance of someone who had slept outdoors for too long. To the enchanted girl, it was extraordinary, absolutely magical, a piece of paradise she had forgotten existed in the real world. To Eleanor, bored by thousands of breakfasts in places like that and much better, it was just another bakery among many others. This brutal difference in perspective bothered her in a way she hadn't expected, revealing privileges she had learned her whole life not to see, to take as absolutely granted. The father, however, remained visibly withdrawn, uncomfortable in every fiber of his tense body. He sat in the chair furthest from the bustling dining area, like someone who doesn't want to take up too much space, like someone who instinctively knows his presence makes other customers uncomfortable, that his poverty is an unwelcome embarrassment in the eyes of those who are there to enjoy a pleasant moment. His eyes carefully avoided the other well-dressed patrons, and his hands remained still in his lap, closed in tight fists that tried to hide the constant tremor that prolonged cold and accumulated hunger had ruthlessly caused for days. Eleanor ordered strong, steaming coffee, warm, crusty rolls, creamy, butter, fresh cheese, ham, freshly squeezed orange juice for the child, warm milk. She ordered more than necessary for 2 people, perhaps to compensate for something she couldn't precisely name, perhaps because she knew no other way to help than through generous excess. She watched in silent attention as the girl ate with carefully controlled hunger, despite the evident urgency, visibly trying not to appear desperate in the eyes of others. trying to maintain the composure and good manners her father had clearly taught with such diligence even in the worst moments of their lives. She was a genuinely well-behaved a child who had learned that even in the most intense hunger there is dignity to be preserved, that even in the deepest despair, form is to be maintained. The father ate little, almost nothing in fact, preferring to repeatedly ensure his daughter had enough before thinking of himself, discreetly placing extra pieces of bread on her plate when he thought no one was paying attention. And it was there, in that absolutely ordinary neighborhood bakery, on a rainy morning like so many other rainy mornings the city had seen, that Eleanor finally began to truly see. Not just to look superficially as she did with almost everything in her hurried life, but to truly see with depth, with a clarity that frightened and fascinated her at the same time. The worn and faded clothes, yes, but the polite and refined gestures that spoke of careful upbringing, of a family that once had very different concerns, the low, measured voice, but the naturally upright posture of someone who once held positions of responsibility, who was once respected and heard in his workplace, who once had colleagues and subordinates and superiors who valued his opinion. Small scattered signs that told a completely different story from what the present situation suggested at first glance. A story of a dizzying and unexpected fall, not of humble origin. When the girl excitedly got up to look more closely at the colorful pastry display, genuinely enchanted by colors and shapes she had forgotten existed in the world, a school uniform accidentally slipped from the backpack she carried everywhere. It was crumpled and stained from use, clearly without regular use for many days or weeks, but it was from a recognized and respected private school. Eleanor immediately recognized the embroidered crest on the pocket of the navy blue uniform, an expensive and traditional school, one of those that only accept families of a proven economic level, one of those that charge tuition fees equivalent to the monthly salary of many honest American workers. Her surprised gaze met the man's, who quickly looked away with evident shame. The shame was palpable in the air between them, a third uncomfortable presence sitting at the table like a ghost. It wasn't the shame of someone who had always been poor, who was born without resources and learned early on to live with it as a natural part of existence. It was the specific and biting shame of someone who had fallen from a considerable height, who had known very different realities, who one day had everything organized and planned for the future, and now had absolutely nothing. It was a particular and painful shame, the shame of sudden loss, of unexpected failure, of the inability to maintain what he had built with so much effort over the years. Eleanor said nothing about the uniform she had seen. She simply filed that information silently in her analytical mind, sensing that there was much more hidden in that story than she could initially imagine. Every detail she noticed was a piece of a complex puzzle she couldn't yet see in its entirety, but which already intrigued her in a way that absolutely nothing had intrigued her for a very, very long time. A crumpled paper note slipped out from the girl's papers when she returned excitedly to the table, thrilled by the promise of a special sweet treat Eleanor had ordered just for her. Eleanor picked up the paper almost by automatic reflex, and before she could politely return it without looking, her eyes caught the printed words. It was an official summons from the private school. An urgent request for the students' guardians to attend the institution as soon as possible to address important matters. The date printed on the paper was more than 3 long weeks old, and the paper was visibly crumpled and stained from being folded and unfolded so many times, from being read with anguish and put away with an impossible-to-overcome guilt. The man immediately realized what she had seen by accident. his face contorted in a silent pain, impossible to completely hide, the pain of having his most intimate failures exposed to a complete, well-dressed stranger, the pain of not even being able to respond to a basic and simple call from his own beloved daughter's school. He reached out to take the note back, an almost desperate and urgent gesture. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice cracking at the edges. "You weren't supposed to see that. Please, give it back to me." Eleanor returned the paper without comment, but that small, involuntary discovery opened an important window into the story she was beginning to methodically piece together in her mind, accustomed to analyzing data and finding patterns. An elite private school that hadn't been attended for weeks, an expensive uniform kept as a relic of definitively better times, an official summons unanswered because there was simply no way to answer it, no fixed address, no stability, absolutely nothing beyond the daily struggle for survival. And those two, father and daughter, united in adversity, sleeping at bus stops when they were lucky, and in worse places when they weren't, surviving on the uncertain charity of strangers. The pieces definitely did not fit the simplistic narrative of chronic poverty that would easily explain everything and allow her to move on without thinking about it further. They told a much more complex and disturbing story, a story of sudden and unexpected collapse, of freefall without a safety net. "What's your name?" Eleanor asked gently to the child, trying to soften the tense moment, trying to create some genuine human connection that went beyond cold and impersonal charity. "Lily," she answered promptly with a smile, wiping her butter-smeared mouth with the back of her hand in a childlike spontaneous gesture that contrasted with the forced maturity of her eyes. "And this is my dad, David. He's the best dad in the whole world, you know." David. The name hung in the air for a moment, as if it had its own weight and substance. Eleanor repeated it mentally several times, trying to associate it with something, with someone from her professional past. It seemed vaguely familiar, in a way she couldn't rationally explain, like a melody one instinctively recognizes but can't name. "It's a pleasure to meet both of you," Eleanor said sincerely for the first time that entire morning, feeling that she was being genuine, that the words weren't just empty social formulas repeated out of politeness, but true expressions of what she really felt at that moment. "My name is Eleanor." David nodded his head in formal thanks, still avoiding looking her directly in the eyes, still hiding behind the protective walls that shame had built around him as a defense. There was so much in that man that he desperately tried to hide from others' eyes. So much history he preferred to keep buried and forgotten. So much pain he didn't want to share with anyone, much less with a rich stranger who would probably judge him as so many others had already judged. But silences speak, sometimes much louder than spoken words, and Eleanor was finally beginning to hear what that prolonged silence was trying to say, with such mute eloquence. "You're very kind, ma'am," he finally said, after a long, uncomfortable pause, his voice carrying the immense weight of someone who is not at all used to receiving kindness from strangers, of someone who has learned to distrust offers that seem too good to be true. "You didn't have to do any of this for us." "Perhaps I did," Eleanor replied, surprising herself once again with the honesty that escaped her lips without prior permission. "Perhaps I needed this more than you. Two can imagine." Time passed strangely in that warm, cozy bakery. Eleanor was no longer in any hurry to go to her important meeting. In fact, she had completely forgotten about it. Forgotten the multi-million-dollar contracts awaiting her urgent signature, forgotten the numbers that needed her careful analysis, forgotten absolutely everything that before seemed so terribly urgent and unavoidable. She was there, entirely present in a way she hadn't been anywhere for a long time, fully living a moment instead of just rushing through it as she did with almost everything in her life. When they finally got up to leave, the rain had diminished considerably outside, but the sky remained grey and heavy, threatening, promising more water later in the day. Eleanor looked at the two of them, at that girl who held her father's hand with unwavering confidence, despite everything they had been through together, at that man who carried the weight of the entire world on his shoulders without letting his daughter realize the true size of the burden. And she felt with crystal clarity that she couldn't simply leave there, go back to her life before as if nothing had happened, as if that encounter hadn't changed something fundamental within her. "Where are you going now?" she asked, knowing the answer probably wouldn't be easy to hear, but needing to hear it anyway to fully understand. David hesitated visibly, his eyes unsuccessfully searching for some neutral place to land. Lily looked at him with an expression that mixed hope and adult understanding, the expression of a child who had already learned too many things children shouldn't know, who already knew truths that adults prefer to keep hidden and protected. "There's a shelter near the bus terminal," he finally answered, his voice low as if he were ashamed of the very words he spoke. "Sometimes we get a spot to spend the night there when there's availability." Eleanor felt her stomach clench with painful force. A precarious shelter, an uncertain spot, sometimes. That bright and hopeful girl, with her colorful drawings full of dreams, and her private school, and her eyes full of a still possible future, sleeping in shelters when there was a spot available, sleeping who knows where when there wasn't, when the spots ran out and the doors closed in their faces once again. "Let me take you there," Eleanor offered, the words coming out before she could carefully measure them or calculate the implications. "My car is parked nearby. At least you won't have to walk in the rain." Eleanor spent the following weeks consumed by an obsession she couldn't fully explain herself. The encounter at the bus stop haunted her like an insistent ghost, appearing at the most unexpected moments, during important meetings, in the middle of elegant dinners, in the silent hours of dawn, when sleep refused to come. David's face, marked by exhaustion and shame, appeared in her mind like a silent accusation. Lily's hopeful smile haunted her like an unanswered question. She began to investigate, first timidly, like someone doing something forbidden, then with the methodical determination that had made her a successful executive. She discovered David's full name through the records of the school Lily attended before their fall. She found old news articles about his dismissal, brief reports that painted a very different picture than the one he had told in the car. In the reports, he appeared as a problematic employee, a difficult man who didn't adapt to corporate culture, someone who was fired for incompetence and misconduct. It was a carefully constructed narrative, Eleanor realized, with the sharp eye of someone who knew the inner workings of the corporate world well. The company that had destroyed him was Meridian Global, a conglomerate Eleanor knew by name and reputation. She had done business with them on more than one occasion, participated in events in the same social circles, shaken hands with the same smiling executives who now appeared as David's tormentors. The irony was not lost on her, and it brought with it a bitter taste of involuntary complicity. Eleanor hired a discreet private investigator, a man of few scruples but great competence, whom she occasionally used for due diligence on risky business deals. She asked him to find out everything about David's case, all the evidence, all the documents, all the witnesses. What he brought back, weeks later, was explosive. David had not lied about anything. On the contrary, he had minimized the severity of what he had discovered. Meridian Global was involved in an accounting fraud scheme that involved millions of dollars diverted, overbilled contracts with government agencies, systematic bribery of government officials. David had accidentally stumbled upon documents that proved all of this, and his attempt at internal whistleblowing had been met, not with gratitude, but with a coordinated campaign of personal and professional destruction. There were more victims like him, other employees who had seen too much and paid the price. Some had managed to rebuild their lives in other cities, others had sunk into deep depressions. One had committed suicide 2 years earlier. It was a systematic pattern of silencing that repeated itself whenever someone dared to question the company's practices. Eleanor spent nights studying the documents, making connections, building a mental map of the scheme. It was bigger than she had imagined, involved more powerful people, had ramifications that reached unexpected places, and the more she discovered, the more she felt a cold, determined rage grow within her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. She had enough money to fight this battle. She had enough influence to open doors that remained closed to people like David. And she had, for the first time in decades, a purpose that went beyond accumulating more wealth and more power. She had a chance to do something that mattered. The first step was to find David and Lily again. It wasn't easy. They had no fixed address, no phone, no stable point of contact. Eleanor visited shelters, talked to social workers, visited churches that offered free meals. Each time she found a lead, it led nowhere. For weeks, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack of human misery. It was on a Thursday afternoon, almost 2 months after their first meeting, that she finally found them. They were in a public park, in an outer neighborhood Eleanor had never set foot in before. Lily was drawing on a bench, using crayons that some kind soul must have donated. David was a few yards away, standing by the door of a store, probably asking for work again and being refused again. Eleanor stopped her car across the street and watched for a moment. They were thinner than last time, more worn out. Winter had taken its toll in nights spent outdoors and skipped meals. But Lily still drew with the same concentration as always, still protected her papers as if they were treasures, and David still carried the weight of the world on his shoulders without letting his daughter see. She crossed the street with determined steps. Lily was the first to see her, and her face lit up with immediate recognition. "Miss Eleanor!" she shouted, getting up from the bench and running towards her. David turned at the sound of the name, and Eleanor saw in his eyes a mixture of surprise, distrust, and something that looked like reluctant hope. He walked towards them slowly, like someone approaching something that might be too good to be true. "Miss Eleanor," he said, formal as always. "I didn't expect to see you again." "I looked for you," Eleanor replied simply. "I need to talk to you, it's important." She took them to a nearby coffee shop, ordered enough food and drinks for a week, and began to tell them everything she had discovered. David listened in silence, his face moving from incredulity to astonishment, from astonishment to anger, from anger to something that looked like hope for the first time in a long time. "You did all that?" he asked when she finished. "You investigated the company, hired people, gathered all this evidence? Why?" Eleanor thought about the question for a moment. Why, indeed? She didn't have a simple answer, no rational explanation that made sense, in a world that operated on calculated interests. "Because I saw you," she said finally. "I really saw you. Not just looked, but saw. And once you truly see, you can't pretend you didn't." David remained silent for a long moment, processing it all. Lily, who had understood little of the adults' conversation but sensed the importance of the moment, held her father's hand tightly. "And what do you plan to do with all this?" he asked. "I plan to destroy them," Eleanor replied, and her voice carried a conviction that surprised her. "Legally, methodically, completely, I intend to prove you were right, clear your name, and make them pay for everything they did. But for that I need your help. I need you to trust me." The legal battle that followed lasted months and consumed immense resources. Eleanor hired the best white-collar crime attorneys, assembled a team of investigators who worked day and night, used her network of contacts to open doors in regulatory bodies and newsrooms. David, for his part, provided detailed testimonies, identified other victims, helped decipher technical documents that only someone who had worked at the company could understand. Throughout this time, Eleanor insisted that David and Lily move into an apartment she had kept empty for years. He resisted at first, his wounded pride protesting against what seemed like more charity. But Lily needed stability, needed a fixed roof over her head, needed to go back to school. And in the end, as always happened, love for his daughter overcame the father's pride. The months of living together brought the three of them closer in unexpected ways. Eleanor discovered she liked having people around, that the silence of her penthouse apartment was more oppressive than she admitted. David discovered he could allow himself help without losing his dignity, that accepting didn't mean diminishing himself. Lily, with the simple wisdom of children, simply assumed that things were as they should be, and treated Eleanor like a surrogate aunt or grandmother from day one. When the story finally broke, it was bigger than anyone expected. National newspapers, prime-time news reports, investigations by the state attorney's office. Meridian global executives fell one by one, some arrested, others fled to countries without extradition treaties. The company, stripped of its respectable facade, revealed itself to be what it had always been, a criminal organization disguised as a corporation. David had his name completely cleared. More than that, he became a kind of accidental hero, the ordinary man who dared to challenge the powerful and won. He received job offers from dozens of companies that wanted to associate with his image of integrity. He chose a position in a non-profit organization that helped victims of corporate misconduct, using his own experience to guide others through the same difficult path he had walked. Lily went back to school, not the same one as before, but an equally good one. She made new friends, resumed her activities, became a normal child again with normal child concerns. Her drawings, which during the difficult months had become darker and more melancholic, regained vibrant colors and cheerful themes. She still kept the old ones as a reminder, but no longer needed them as protection. And Eleanor discovered that the wealth she had accumulated throughout her life had finally found a purpose that made sense. It wasn't about the numbers in the bank accounts, it never had been. It was about what you could do with those numbers, about the lives you could touch, about the injustices you could correct. The apartment she had lent to David and Lily never became empty again, not because they needed it, but because none of the three wanted it to be. What began as charity turned into partnership, partnership into friendship, friendship into something none of them quite knew how to name, but which all recognized as family. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, like the sunrise on a winter morning, when the darkness slowly gives way to light, so slowly that you barely notice the change until it has already happened. Eleanor discovered that changing decades-old habits required a patience she didn't know she possessed. In the first few months, she still woke up at 5 in the morning by reflex, still checked emails before getting out of bed, still thought in terms of productivity and efficiency. But gradually, David and Lily's presence began to alter her rhythms, soften her edges, reminding her that there was life beyond spreadsheets. Breakfast became sacred rituals. Lily insisted on helping prepare, even if her help meant more mess than practicality. David made coffee with an almost scientific precision, measuring the exact amount of grounds and water, explaining to anyone who would listen that well-made coffee was an art form. Eleanor, who had spent years gulping down bad coffee in endless meetings, found she agreed with him. Evenings were dedicated to conversations without a defined purpose, the kind of conversation Eleanor had forgotten existed. They talked about everything and nothing, movies they had seen, books they wanted to read, childhood memories that popped up out of nowhere, plans for a future that now seemed possible. Lily was the heart of that new family arrangement. Her presence filled the apartment with an energy Eleanor hadn't known was missing. She hummed while drawing, asked endless questions about absolutely everything, invented elaborate stories about the characters in her drawings. She had an imagination that seemed boundless, a capacity to find wonder in the ordinary that the adults around her had lost long ago. Eleanor sometimes found herself simply observing the girl, fascinated by the way she existed in the world. There was no filter, no calculation, no constant self-censorship that characterized adult life. Lily was authentically herself at all times, and this authenticity was both refreshing and slightly painful for Eleanor, who wondered when exactly she had lost the ability to be that way. David, in turn, flourished in visible ways. The exhaustion that seemed permanent when they met gradually gave way to renewed energy. He laughed more, slept better, spoke of the future without the tone of defeat that had previously colored every word. The work at the organization that helped victims of corporate misconduct gave him purpose and satisfaction that his old job, with all its prestige, had never provided. He was grateful to Eleanor. That was evident in every gesture, in every look. But gratitude gradually gave way to something more horizontal, less burdened by the asymmetry that exists between helper and helped. They became partners in a broader sense, two adults navigating life together, each bringing their own strengths and weaknesses to the equation. Eleanor discovered she liked to cook, something she had never done seriously before. David taught her recipes his deceased wife had passed down to him, simple dishes laden with history and affection. The kitchen, which had once been just another decorated room, became a space of creation and connection, full of aromas and conversations and small messes that no one was in a hurry to clean up. The trip to the beach that Lily had requested finally happened over a long weekend, 6 months after their first meeting. It was a simple beach town along the Carolina coast, far from the luxurious resorts Eleanor frequented on her rare vacations. But Lily's joy at seeing the ocean, her carefree laughter as she ran from the waves, the look of peace on David's face as he watched his daughter play, all of it was worth more than any exotic destination. Eleanor sat on the sand, feeling the sun on her face and the wind in her hair, and realized she hadn't thought about work for hours. It was a strange, almost unsettling sensation at first, this absence of the constant anxiety that had accompanied her for decades, but it was also liberating in a way she hadn't expected. That night, in a simple motel with thin walls and inconsistent shower pressure, the three shared a room for practicality. Lily fell asleep first, exhausted from so much play, her hair still damp from her ocean swim. David and Eleanor stayed up a little longer, talking in whispers so as not to wake her. "Thank you," he said, in a moment of silence. "For what?" "For everything. But especially for this, for giving her this." Eleanor looked at the sleeping girl, at the expression of absolute peace on her face. "She gave me much more than I gave her," she said, "and it was true. You both gave me." David didn't answer with words. He simply held her hand in the dark, a simple gesture that carried more meaning than any elaborate declaration could. Months passed, and life found its new normal. Eleanor reduced her business activities, delegating more, working less, prioritizing differently. She discovered that the world didn't end when she wasn't in control of everything, that companies continued to function, that deals continued to be closed even without her constant supervision. She used the freed-up time and money for projects that mattered. In addition to David's organization, she financed legal aid programs for vulnerable workers, created scholarships for at-risk children, invested in initiatives that would never yield financial returns, but provided a different kind of return, harder to measure but equally valuable. People in her old social circle found the change strange. Some thought her eccentric, others considered her foolish for wasting her potential on philanthropic causes when she could be multiplying her fortune. Eleanor discovered she didn't care about their opinion, and that discovery was more liberating than any other. Lily turned 9 at a birthday party that brought together her new school friends, David's colleagues, and some neighbors from the building. It was a simple party, with homemade cake and improvised decorations, but Lily declared it was the best party of her life. Eleanor suspected it was true. The cake had been made by the 3 of them together on an afternoon of controlled chaos in the kitchen, with flour everywhere and laughter echoing through the apartment. It was lopsided and uneven, the frosting lopsided on one side, the candles stuck in at strange angles. But Lily proudly displayed it to all the guests, explaining in elaborate detail how she had helped make it. When they sang Happy Birthday, Eleanor found herself crying, not from sadness, but from something she took a while to identify as simple happiness, a feeling so unknown it was almost startling. David, beside her, put his arm around her shoulders in a gesture of comfort and complicity. The friendship between them had evolved in ways neither had planned or expected. It wasn't romantic in the conventional sense, at least not yet. But it was deep and true in a way few relationships managed to be. They were partners, confidants, accomplices in a life project that no manual described. Eleanor sometimes thought of her mother, long dead. She wondered what she would say if she could see her life now. Her mother had been a practical woman, a woman of few words and much action, who had worked hard her whole life to provide opportunities for her children. Would she have approved of this version of Eleanor? This woman who had finally learned that some things are more important than success and money? She liked to think so. She liked to imagine her mother watching from somewhere, nodding with silent approval. The seasons changed, bringing their own transformations. The following winter was different from the previous one, no longer a threat to be faced, but just a season like any other, with its cold days and long nights that were opportunities to cozy up at home with the people she loved. Lily fell in love with astronomy, then with dinosaurs, then with musical instruments. Each passion was lived with the total intensity only children can dedicate to their interests. Eleanor funded violin lessons, books on paleontology, a small telescope that sat on the windowsill to observe the stars on clear nights. David finished writing a book about his experience, a practical guide for workers facing similar situations. Eleanor helped him find a publisher, and the first edition sold out in weeks. He began giving lectures, participating in debates, becoming a recognized voice in the fight for workers' rights. The man Eleanor had met at a bus stop, huddled and defeated, had transformed into something completely different. But he never forgot where he came from. Every time someone congratulated him on his success, he made a point of remembering that he had gotten to where he was because someone had stopped to see. Eleanor, sitting in the audience at one of his lectures, heard him tell the story of the bus stop, of the woman in the grey trench coat who stopped when everyone else passed by without looking. "Sometimes," he said, looking directly at her as he spoke, "all someone needs is to be seen, truly seen, not just looked at. And when you truly see someone, you become responsible for that person in some way. That responsibility might seem like a burden, but it's actually a gift. It's the most human thing there is." Eleanor smiled at him, her eyes welling up. Beside her, Lily held her hand, as she always did when they were together in public, as if to ensure Eleanor wouldn't disappear. After the lecture, the 3 went to dinner at a simple restaurant near the event venue. Lily drew on the napkins while the adults talked, creating an entire world of characters that she explained in elaborate detail to anyone who would listen. "This is the king of the land of clouds," she said, pointing to a round figure with a crooked crown. "And this is the queen. They're happy because they live together in a cotton castle." "And who is this?" Eleanor asked, pointing to a third figure smaller than the other two. "That's me," Lily said, as if it were obvious. "I'm the princess who came from far away, and they adopted. Now we're a family." Eleanor and David exchanged a look over the girl's head. There was so much in that small drawing, so much understanding of what they had built together. Children understand things that adults overcomplicate, and Lily had summarized in a napkin doodle what would take pages to explain in words. The server brought the check. Eleanor grabbed it before David could move, as she always did. He had already given up protesting, accepting this implicit division of roles they had established. She paid the restaurant bills. He prepared breakfast. She took care of the practical and bureaucratic matters. He brought lightness and joy. Each contributed what they had and what they knew. On the way home, Lily fell asleep in the back seat of the car, as she had done the first time she rode in that vehicle. But now, there was no anguish, no uncertain destination. There was just a tired child returning home after a good day, secure in the knowledge that there would be other good days ahead. Eleanor looked in the rearview mirror, saw the serene face of the girl, and once again felt that wave of emotion that still surprised her after all these months. She had never thought of herself as maternal, had never imagined she would feel for a child who wasn't hers, this fierce and protective love she felt for Lily. "She changed you," David said, as if reading her thoughts. "You both changed me," Eleanor corrected. "For the better?" She thought about the question. She thought about the woman she was before, the efficient and cold executive who went through life without truly living. She thought about all the things she had achieved and all the things she had lost along the way. "To be more human," she said finally. "And I think that's better, yes." David nodded, satisfied with the answer. The rest of the ride was made in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only exists between people who don't need to fill the air with empty words. When they got home, David carried a sleeping Lily to her room, changed her into pajamas without fully waking her, and adjusted the covers with the meticulous care he applied to everything involving his daughter. Eleanor watched from the doorway, storing the scene in her memory as she stored precious moments, knowing that it was these small domestic scenes that defined a life much more than grand events. "Good night, my princess of the land of clouds," David whispered, kissing his daughter's forehead. "Good night, Daddy," she murmured, half asleep. "Good night, Eleanor." It was the first time Lily hadn't called her Ms. Eleanor or Auntie. It was just Eleanor, simple as that, as if calling a family member. Eleanor felt her eyes sting once more. "Good night, my dear," she replied, her voice choked. Later, alone in her room, Eleanor looked out the window at the illuminated city below. The same city as always, with its lights and its noises and its chronic indifference. But everything seemed different now, seen through the eyes of someone who had finally learned to truly see. Somewhere out there, at some bus stop or park bench, other people were waiting. Other fathers hugged other children against the cold and fear. Other children dreamed of homes that no longer existed. Eleanor couldn't save all of them. She knew that, but she could do her part, however small. She could stop when others passed by. She could see when others looked without perceiving. And perhaps, if enough people did the same, the world could be a little less cold. The rain began to fall again, tapping softly against the window in a rhythm that was almost musical. Eleanor smiled to herself, remembering that first rainy morning that had changed everything. Sometimes, she thought as she finally prepared for sleep, life takes us exactly where we need to be, even when we don't know we need it. And sometimes it all begins with an unplanned stop, a gesture of kindness, a simple phrase from a child who just wanted to go home. She closed her eyes and slept the peaceful sleep of someone who had finally found her place in the world. And if you ask Eleanor today what changed her life, she won't talk about multi-million-dollar contracts or brilliant business decisions. She'll talk about a rainy morning, about an exhausted father who wouldn't give up protecting his daughter, about a girl with colorful drawings and a smile that insisted on existing despite everything. And she'll talk about the simplest and most powerful phrase she had ever heard in her entire life. We just wanted to go home, because in the end, that's what we all want. A place to belong, people to love and be loved. A home that is not just an address, but a feeling of security and welcome. And sometimes, when we least expect it, we find that home in the most unlikely places, in the most unexpected people, on rainy mornings that seem just like all the others, but aren't. The first rays of sun on a new Sunday streamed through the apartment window, illuminating the living room, where 3 lives had intertwined in ways none of them could have predicted. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the aroma of fresh bread David had picked up from the corner bake shop early, before the rest of the house woke up. Eleanor was the second to wake, guided by the familiar scent to the kitchen. She found David already dressed, reading something on his phone, while the coffee maker hummed quietly. "Good morning," she said, her voice still hoarse with sleep. "Good morning," he replied with a smile. "Sleep well?" "Like I haven't in a long time." It was true. Since David and Lily had entered her life, the sleepless nights that had haunted her for years had become rare. There was something in the simple fact of not being alone, of knowing that there was life around her, that calmed the demons that used to visit her in the darkness. Lily appeared minutes later, her hair disheveled and her eyes still small from sleep, carrying her sketchbook as always. She sat at the table without saying anything, began to draw automatically while waiting for breakfast to be served. It was her morning ritual, this silent moment of creation before the day truly began. Eleanor watched her work, fascinated as always by the absolute concentration the girl dedicated to her art. The strokes were more confident now than when they first met, more elaborate, more full of detail. Lily had real talent, something that went beyond the natural creativity of children. Eleanor had already talked to David about finding an art teacher for her, someone who could develop that potential. "What are you drawing today?" she asked. Lily lifted her sketchbook to show. It was a drawing of a house, but not just any house. It was clearly the apartment where they lived, with its large windows and the balcony where they liked to have breakfast on weekends. And in front of the house, 3 figures holding hands, each perfectly identifiable despite the simplicity of the drawing. "It's our house," Lily said, as if explaining something obvious, "with us in front." Our house. Eleanor felt her heart swell in a good way. How long had it been since she heard that expression referring to a place that was hers? Decades, probably, since she left her parents' house to build her own life. She had never again felt that a place was truly her home. "It's beautiful," she said, and her voice came out more choked than she intended. "I'm going to make a big painting of this," Lily declared, already planning. "To hang in the living room. That way everyone who visits will know we live here together." David exchanged a look with Eleanor over the girl's head. There was so much in that look, so much shared history in such a short time, so much hope for the future. They didn't need words to communicate what they felt. The words would come later in due time when they were ready. Breakfast stretched for more than an hour, as it always did on Sundays. They talked about plans for the day, about the week ahead, about a movie Lily wanted to watch and an outing David wanted to take. They were mundane, everyday conversations, the kind that millions of families had every day without giving them much thought. But for the 3 of them, each of these conversations was a small miracle. Every moment of normalcy was a victory against the chaos that had been their lives not long ago. They knew the price of stability. They knew the terror of uncertainty. They had lived days when they didn't know where they would sleep or what they would eat. Therefore, every peaceful breakfast was celebrated internally, every night in their own bed was silently appreciated. After breakfast, they went together to the local farmers' market. It was another tradition they had developed in recent months, this Sunday stroll among fruit and vegetable stalls, the smell of savoury fried pastries mixing with the chatter of people bargaining prices. Lily loved the market. She liked to help choose the fruits, testing the firmness of apples and the smell of melons, as if she were an expert. The vendors already knew her, greeted her by name, saved the best oranges for when she arrived. "Good morning, Miss Eleanor," said the gentleman at the vegetable stall. "Today I have a beautiful, crisp, fresh head of lettuce." It was another sign of how their lives had changed. To be known, to be expected, to be part of a community. Eleanor, who had spent years living in the anonymity of her luxury apartments, discovered that she liked this feeling of belonging. They returned home laden with bags, laughing about something Lily had said on the way. The sun was strong now, winter finally giving way to warmer days. The city seemed different under this light, less grey, less oppressive. In the afternoon, while Lily did her homework in the living room, Eleanor and David talked in the kitchen about practical matters. There were decisions to make, plans to form. Life continued to demand attention, even when the major crises had passed. "The organization offered me a director position," David said, a mix of pride and hesitation in his voice. "It means more responsibility, more travel, more time away from home." "And you want to accept?" "I want to make a difference. I want to help more people, but I don't want it to cost me time with Lily. She's already lost so much." Eleanor thought for a moment before replying. "She won't lose you," she finally said. "No matter how many trips you take, she knows you always come back, and I'll be here when you can't be." David looked at her with an intensity she hadn't yet seen in his eyes. "You'd do that? You'd take care of her when I had to travel?" "I already do," Eleanor replied simply. "She's my family now, too." The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. It was the first time Eleanor had so openly declared what she felt, had put into words what had become obvious to everyone around them. David didn't answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was soft. "I never imagined I'd find this again," he said. "A family, a home, people to trust completely. After I lost my wife, after everything that happened, I thought that part of my life was over forever. I also thought I'd given up on having a family," Eleanor admitted. "I spent so many years building a career, accumulating things, that I forgot to build what really matters. And now I have both of you. And that's worth more than everything I built before." They looked at each other for a long moment, and Eleanor felt that something was transforming between them, something that went beyond friendship and gratitude. It wasn't the time to name that feeling, not yet. But the seed was planted, and both knew it would eventually blossom. Night arrived softly, as it often did on good days. Dinner was simple, a soup. David prepared with the vegetables bought at the farmer's market. Lily talked about a school project, something about planets and stars she was enthusiastically studying. After dinner, the three settled on the couch to watch a movie together. Lily chose, as always, a colourful animation that the two adults had already watched dozens of times, but neither of them complained. Watching the same movie repeatedly was a small price to pay for the joy of seeing Lily laugh at the same jokes, get emotional during the same scenes, hug her teddy bear during moments of tension. Eleanor looked around as the movie played, at the living room that had transformed in recent months, now full of life and colour, at Lily's drawings hanging on the walls, at David's books stacked on the shelves, at the small objects each had brought and that together created something greater than the sum of their parts. This was a home, she realized, not the walls or the furniture, but the people within them, the memories being built, the rituals being established, the love being cultivated day after day in small, constant gestures. Lily fell asleep before the end of the movie, as often happened, David carried her to her room while Eleanor tidied up what was out of place. These were automatic gestures now, a domestic choreography they had developed without realizing it. When they met again in the living room, the apartment was silent. The movie had ended. The screen showed the credits rolling in silence. The city outside continued its nightlife, but it seemed distant, irrelevant. "Thank you," David said, as he often did, "for everything." "Stop thanking me," Eleanor replied with a smile. "I already told you, you gave me much more than I gave you. Even so, thank you for stopping that day. Thank you for seeing us when everyone else just passed by." Eleanor thought of that rainy morning, which seemed like a lifetime ago, of the woman she was then, hurried and distracted and closed off from the world, and of the woman she was now, still imperfect in many ways, but fundamentally different. "Sometimes," she said, "life puts us exactly where we need to be. We can call it destiny, coincidence, providence. The name doesn't matter. What matters is what we do when we get there." David nodded, understanding perfectly. "And what will you do now?" he asked. "Keep going," she replied. "One day at a time, building this thing we're building, taking care of these people who have become my family." It was a simple answer for a life that had become complex, but sometimes the simple answers are the truest ones. The full moon illuminated the city through the window when Eleanor finally retired to her room. Lying in bed, she heard the familiar sounds of the apartment preparing for sleep, the soft closing of doors, the distant murmur of traffic below, the quiet breathing of people sleeping in nearby rooms, sounds of home, sounds of family, sounds she didn't know she needed to hear until she started hearing them. She closed her eyes with a smile on her lips. Tomorrow would be another day, with its own challenges and joys. There would be problems to solve, decisions to make, moments of doubt and moments of certainty. Life would continue to demand courage and patience and love from them. But for now, at this moment, everything was fine. For now, everyone was home. Eleanor still remembered with clarity the exact moment she realized her life had irrevocably changed. It wasn't during the legal battle, nor when the newspapers published the story, nor even when David and Lily moved into the apartment. It was on an ordinary afternoon, weeks after all that, when she returned from work early and found the two of them in the kitchen trying to bake a cake. Flour was everywhere. Lily had chocolate on her face and in her hair. David held a wooden spoon with the expression of someone facing a formidable enemy. And when they saw her at the door, they both started to laugh, an uncontrolled and contagious laugh that soon enveloped her too. It was in that moment, laughing until her stomach hurt in a flour-covered kitchen, that Eleanor understood what she had found. It wasn't just a cause to defend or people to help. It was a life to live. A real life, with mess and imperfection and moments of absurd joy that didn't follow any script. The cake was lopsided and burned at the edges. They ate it anyway, the three of them together at the kitchen table, pretending it was delicious while making discreet, funny faces. It was the best cake Eleanor had ever tasted in her entire life. Since then, each day brought new discoveries. Eleanor learned that children ask impossible questions at the most inconvenient times, that dirty laundry accumulates much faster when there are three of you, that the silence of a child concentrating on her drawings is one of the most precious sounds in the world, that the fear of losing someone we love is proportional to the intensity of that love. David learned that accepting help was not weakness, it was wisdom. That rebuilding a life was possible even when it seemed impossible, that love could emerge in the most unexpected places between people whom fate brought together through winding paths. And Lily, with the natural wisdom of children, simply accepted that her family had grown, that it now included a grey-haired woman who took her for ice cream and watched her drawings with genuine attention. For her, There was nothing strange about it. Families grew all the time, in ways that adults complicated, but children understood instinctively. The neighbors in the building got used to this atypical family. The doorman knew Eleanor had permanent guests and treated them with the same respect he showed the owner. Other residents greeted David and Lily in the elevator, asked about school, commented on the weather. It was the normalcy they had so desired, finally achieved. Lily's school welcomed her back without judgment, only with relief to see her well. The teachers noticed the change, the restored confidence, the joy that had returned to the girl's eyes. She made friends quickly, as resilient children often do. She invited them to play at the apartment, and Eleanor discovered she liked the sound of children running through the hallways, their laughter and arguments and games. Eleanor's colleagues also noticed the change. The ruthless boss had softened, was more patient, more present. She was still competent and demanding, still made difficult decisions when necessary, but there was something different in her approach. A humanity that had once been hidden under layers of professionalism. Some attributed the change to age. Others speculated about secret relationships or midlife crises. Few knew the real story, and Eleanor preferred it that way. What had happened was hers. It was theirs, the three of them. It didn't need to be displayed or explained to have value. The months passed, each bringing its own lessons and challenges. There were difficult days, of course, days when Lily woke up crying from nightmares about their time on the streets, days when David stared into space, lost in painful memories, days when Eleanor wondered if she was doing the right thing, if she was capable of being what that family needed. But the good days outnumbered the bad, in quantity and intensity, and even on bad days they had each other. They had arms to hug, shoulders to cry on, ears to listen. They had a home to return to, no matter how difficult what awaited them outside. That's what it meant to be family, Eleanor finally understood. It wasn't perfection, it wasn't an absence of problems. It was having someone by your side when problems arrived. It was knowing you weren't alone in the world. The rain returned on any given night, tapping against the windows with that familiar rhythm she had learned to love. Eleanor stayed awake listening, remembering that first morning, how different the world was then. If she could go back in time and talk to the woman she was that day, what would she say? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps she would just ask her to keep walking to the bus stop, to pay attention, to stop when her body told her to stop. The rest had unfolded as it should. The rest was history. And now, lying in her bed, listening to the rain fall, surrounded by the sounds of her family sleeping in nearby rooms, Eleanor Vance finally knew what it meant to be home. It was the best feeling in the world. If this story touched your heart, like, comment and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.